No, I think that like a lot of people in my generation, I found that in many cases the types of housing or the types of lifestyle that I think a lot of us wanted to live was just in many cases illegal. I think a lot of folks were realizing, especially this started on the coast, this started in the so-called superstar cities, but it's spreading to places all across the country, that it was just illegal to build the types of housing and the types of communities that many people actually wanted. Also, I played a lot of SimCity as a kid.
Yeah, that's a common theme. So building off of what you're saying with the superstar cities, when you hear about zoning, oftentimes the cities that come to mind, or when you hear about progressive zoning reforms, the thing that's coming to mind is like San Francisco, LA, New York, places that like remove zoning so that they can build more units more quickly when there's like a housing demand. What do you think of, what are some policies that you've seen in places that are a little bit more rusty or Rust Belt cities like Flint? Like what are some things that you think could help push us forward?
Yeah, well, so I generally try to avoid parachuting into cities and doing the horrible consultant thing.
Yeah, we love consultants here.
In that case, I'm going to start billing here. No, actually, it's a great question because I think you're exactly right that a lot of people assume this is like a San Francisco and New York issue. But as I tried to highlight in the talk, a lot of the actually really exciting zoning reform stuff that's happened has happened in cities that are pretty rusty. It's happened in cities that maybe they have a historical stock where like 70-80% of what actually already exists is in some sense non-conforming, right? They have a lot of like old, neighborhood corner stores or storefronts that legally can't be used for a commercial use today because they don't have enough parking or the use is the wrong category. You have, mixed typology neighborhoods that literally couldn't be built today. You have beautiful examples of fourplexes and small apartment buildings and townhouses. And people say, well, that's illegal? Like, well, that's kind of crazy, right?
Right.
So, I actually think there's been some of the most robust leadership on this in places like Hartford and Buffalo and Minneapolis. And in many cases, actually, I think some of the superstar cities are behind the curve.
That's good news for us. So you bring up the storefronts that currently cannot be used under our zoning. So that's been an issue that people in this room have dealt with. I know at least three people that I can see looking from where I'm at have had this issue.
If you were a loved one has struggled.
Yeah, it's the mesothelioma of the city. But at least three people that I can see in this room have struggled with either the building code or the zoning code in such a way that even though they own the building that they're trying to operate their business from, that business can't start because of something like parking minimums and the minimum parking is not being counted, or the street parking is not counted with the minimum parking. Like Emily Dorr, who's in the back here, who's we will be having our after party at her shop Queens, which is opening soon. She's had significant issues with like that specific issue of like parking minimums. So I know that you probably love to do this, but could you elaborate a little bit on why we should remove parking minimums?
Yes. Do we have any Donald Shute fans in the room? Any Shuteistas? Okay, seek help. No. Yeah, I mean, so I work with a professor at UCLA who's a scholar of parking. And it's so funny because within my world, he's like a celebrity. And I'm like telling my parents, like, Mom, Dad, I'm working with Shute. And they're like, that's nice, sweetie. It's a hugely important issue. And you're exactly right that it's kind of unsexy. It's seen as like a bottom feeder kind of issue. But it's absolutely, essential in terms of determining what can and can't be built, or historic storefronts that can and can't be used for small businesses, or whether or not maybe you can build a couple extra apartments as part of a project. So, I mean, I think a few things to address. One is that parking requirements just raise costs. They raise the cost of new building in contexts where they're forcing more parking to be built than might otherwise have been necessary or appropriate. The second is that they essentially force all new development to take this auto-oriented form. Something like a corner grocery, or maybe even a small multifamily building serving seniors, there might be no parking needed, right? I mean, if you're building a senior affordable building, for example, chances are pretty good that the vast majority of your tenants aren't actually going to own a car.
Right.
And if they do own a car, they probably shouldn't be driving, right? Or a corner grocery, the vast majority of the clientele might be walking or riding a bike or stopping by after a bus ride home. Parking is not only physically infeasible on that lot, it's not necessarily crucial to making that business work. So, I think the incentives are aligned here that, when there really is a need for parking, often in contexts where cities and neighborhoods have removed parking requirements, as I said, developers will still build it because, in many cases you have to build at least some to lease out the space or to sell the space.
Right.
But in many cases, parking requirements just require far more to be built than is actually necessary. And that's why, there's a great thing that the folks at Strong Towns love to do, like go out to a strip mall near your home on Black Friday. Black Friday is theoretically the day when that parking lot should be full. And often these parking lots are like not even like 1/3 full, even on the busiest day of the year. A lot of that parking often is required and can't really be used for anything else.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'd love for us to hit on a little bit more, and I see Mona in the room from Environmental Transformation Movement of Flint, is without something like zoning, right, that says, okay, we're going to zone industrial this or nuisance uses that. I think a lot of people's concern is, what's to stop someone from opening up, I don't know, an asphalt plant immediately next to a residential neighborhood. How do places handle those sorts of nuisance concerns and nuisance issues without what we think of as this sort of strict zoning regime?
Yeah, so, I didn't get too much into the case of Houston, for example, but Houston's fascinating as the one major American city that didn't adopt zoning, and that's the case because they were the only major American city that actually put it to a vote. And working class Houstonians of all races voted against it. They knew that it was going to be a tool to limit housing supply and segregate their city. So how do you deal with problems like that? There are genuine land use problems. Before zoning, many cities would have designated industrial areas or designated areas for certain types of uses. So the most offensive uses, like back in the day, slaughterhouses or tanneries, they would just explicitly say you have to go in a certain area of town, typically far away or downstream or downwind of where the residences are. Alternatively, just actually regulating the nuisance, just having clear, strict, robustly enforced rules for things like smoke or noise or smog. I would also add, right, like I used to live in New Jersey, and basically all of New Jersey is subject to zoning, and you can still commonly see industry going into housing. It's just that we use zoning to often put that industry right next to lower income neighborhoods, right? So zoning doesn't actually solve this problem by separating incompatible uses. In many cases, it just offloads those undesirable uses onto communities that are too politically weak to fight it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that here in Flint we're running into this too, where the reference to an asphalt plant is because it's on a municipal border. The other municipality was able to approve it, even though it is literally across the street from a Flint public housing project. And so I know great folks like Mona's doing excellent work fighting that in the courts right now. Yeah. Oh, we got more folks. That's good.
Well, this is a really good point. And for one, I'm anti-asphalt plant. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Applause on it. Thank you. But I mean, this is kind of a quirk of how we do zoning in the U.S., where every local government does its own zoning code, and there's often little to no coordination among jurisdictions. And so that's, of course, like you can cite the offensive uses right on your border, and there's no conversation that necessarily has to happen. Or you can say, well, we're just not going to allow any affordable housing. Build the affordable housing in some other town, right? There's often just minimal coordination, which is bizarre because, housing markets and labor markets don't start and stop at municipal borders. They're metropolitan. And that's really the scale at which, if we're going to make these decisions, we should be making these decisions.
One other thing I'm curious about, we talked a little bit about this sort of folks having to pursue variances and things like that. I know in our zoning code, that was recently just sort of redone 6 months ago, there are a lot more provisions for uses that are allowed, but they're a special use. They may need an additional level of approval. And I think a lot of folks might say, well, why not, if you want to build that, if it's, maybe just another meeting or two, why not just do a special use? What is with this sort of focus on making things usable by right, or the importance of not just saying, what's one more meeting?
Yeah, a few thoughts on this. The first is, right, I think, the way that zoning was originally intended to work, and I don't say a lot of nice things about early zoning, but I think this was a fine quality, was that if you followed the rules, if you were in a permitted use category, you were pretty much good to go, right? And what's happened over the last 100 years is that the zoning's become stricter, and we've subjected more things to discretion. what's the problem with one more meeting? I mean, for starters, like the planning fees are not free. Like these are thousands of dollars, and the smaller the scale of development or the smaller the scale of the business, the larger those fees are relative to all the other things that these people have to be dealing with. I would say don't punish people for trying to start a small business or build a duplex in their community. Completely backwards. Second is that if it has to go before a planning commission or if it has to go to a city council, that potentially subjects you to scrutiny by the highly unrepresentative people who might show up at a planning hearing at Tuesday at 10 a.m., who might not actually share the perspective on land use that the broader community has. There might be conditions placed that quickly become very expensive. In many cases, if you have to go to city council, of course, then things actually get pretty funky where, you know, the whole thing becomes politicized. I say funky, I mean, in LA, we've had like 2 or 3 council members get indicted in the past 10 years, so funky is a nice way to put it.
Yeah, for us, it's if you're willing to stick around to the 11th hour of the meeting to get it approved.
Right,
Which
so.
means like 3 a.m. basically.
You don't want to talk about zoning at 3 a.m.? Well, no, I mean, it's completely absurd. And I mean, this gets to the kind of bizarre way that we do public process in this country. We know there's overwhelming evidence that the way we do public process doesn't actually elicit any information that reflects broader community preferences. You're getting the preferences of a small number of people who have highly unusually restrictive preferences about what their community looks like. We know that these people tend to be wealthier, they tend to be whiter, they tend to be people who already own property in a community, and of course, naturally they show up and they far disproportionately oppose what's being proposed, right? Because like, if I'm like hardcore NIMBY, I'm gonna show up and fight every single duplex that gets proposed in my neighborhood. If I'm a normal person living a happy life and I'm like, okay, yeah, duplex is getting built, cool, whatever, I'm not gonna go to the public hearing and articulate that perspective. So commissioners and city council members are sitting in a hearing being yelled at by, frankly, a bunch of often very crazy people, and they're not hearing, number one, they're not hearing the perspective of the person who's gonna live in that unit. That person doesn't get a say in these meetings. And then 2, they don't get to hear from the broader scope, maybe the single mom who, like, because there's no childcare provided, these things can't come and speak. Or the person who's having to work 2 shifts, right? The lower income family or household that might have no problem whatsoever with it, might even benefit, might even be the type of person that lives in that unit. They don't get a say. But the person who can show up at 3 p.m. on a Thursday gets to supposedly speak for the public. I get a little riled up on that one, if you can't tell.
Amen. Just so the folks in the audience are aware, at the end, we will be opening this up to a Q&A. But before we do that, talking about how the people who show up to zoning meetings tend to be more particular, and what you're getting out of the zoning code tends to be some of the most intense restrictions that you would see, not the restrictions of the average person. You talk a little bit about red zoning in your talk just now, and I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on how red zoning, which was very explicit racial segregation, a lot of that carried over in a not explicit way into the first zoning codes and now currently modern zoning codes in a lot of ways of like causing racial and also economic segregation. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I mentioned in the talk, this was often fairly explicitly the goal of a lot of these policies, was to segregate cities. I mean, riffing on the discretionary public hearing point that we're just elaborating on, is when you have these discretionary systems, often they get hijacked by people who tend to be a little bit more privileged and tend to have more opportunity, and that's used to essentially block particularly affordable housing in higher opportunity neighborhoods. And that's why, you know, we look at metropolitan America, not a lot of things are going right, but we know that in general neighborhoods are getting a little bit more integrated. But when we step back and look at metropolitan areas, they're actually becoming more segregated. Cities are actually diverging, right, and becoming more homogenous. And that's very weird. Why would that be? Well, because we retain a lot of these local zoning powers with every single little local government. So very affluent suburbs can often say, we're never going to allow anything that's affordable ever. And all of that housing is going to go into generally the most marginalized jurisdiction in the community. So all of that burden of new housing production is falling hardest on places that are least equipped to accommodate it.
And so when you talk about why that housing should be going, why that housing, it's important that affordable options are allowed to go in affluent areas. Can you elaborate a little bit on how zoning has stifled economic mobility?
Yeah, I mean, one of the a pretty robust finding, within social science is that the type of neighborhood that a child grows up in is just hugely determinative of how well their life goes, right? A child who's growing up in a community with more jobs and lower crime and better schools is just going to have so much more opportunity than a child living in a neighborhood with none of those. And right, as I mentioned, historically, there was a high degree of mobility within neighborhoods or within jurisdictions in a metro area or even across the United States. And to the extent that we have used zoning to essentially throw up walls around many of our highest opportunity communities, we've in many cases locked people into places where they just have less opportunity. I think an interesting example, stepping back at the nationwide level, historically, the U.S. was actually becoming more equal. So different regions of the country were becoming more equal as folks would move from lower opportunity places to higher opportunity places. But what we've actually seen over the past few decades, not incidentally around the time that we significantly tightened a lot of these rules, is it's going in the opposite direction. Regions are diverging in terms of opportunity. And I would wager that you would probably be able to find something like that at the metropolitan level. So to the extent that we are using zoning policies to make it hardest to build in the highest opportunity neighborhoods, I think we're having a really, really deleterious impact on expanding access to opportunity.
So I think one thing that, we've talked a lot about, for folks who may be really passionate about affordable housing or folks who are passionate about integrating metro areas, if I'm somebody who I bought my single family home and I love my neighborhood and I'm content and, I want my neighborhood to stay the same and I think it's good as is, why should I care about liberalizing zoning? If let's say, my neighborhood's been the way I bought it when I moved in and I moved there for a reason, what's the interest of someone like that to care about liberalizing zoning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I'll give a heady answer and then I'll give a more direct answer here. The heady answer is that a lot of our great neighborhoods were built by decades of experimentation and trying new things and a mixture of different housing typologies and a mixture of different uses, right? I mean, every city, including Flint, has neighborhoods like this where neighborhoods that have this mixture and have this vitality and have this interesting quality that makes them so great and increasingly less so, but originally very diverse, right? And so if we want to continue to build great neighborhoods and if we want neighborhoods to stay vital, they have to continue to change. I think a lot of people look around them and they say, I love my community, I don't want anything to change. But what you do when you say, I don't want things to change, we're not going to build anything else, is, yeah, the built form of your community remains the same, but the actual people who live in that community is going to start to change very dramatically. I mean, you see this pretty robustly with a lot of historic districts, right? You'll have historic districts where a jurisdiction will say, we're not going to basically allow almost anything to be built or to be significantly changed. And you might fast forward 20 or 30 years down the road, nothing has physically changed in that community, but it's become significantly more affluent, significantly more exclusive. An example from California, something that we found that was really interesting in the 2020 census was you had a lot of small suburbs that had actually lost population. And these weren't places that were dealing with any economic contraction. These were places that were near job centers. They were perfectly fine. What had happened? Well, it was just because they hadn't built any additional new housing, and it was increasingly unaffordable to young families, and you had a lot of aging retirees, and literally the community was just collapsing because there wasn't new types of homes being built that allowed new families to come in. There weren't new storefronts being built. There weren't new small businesses opening. So in a certain sense, like a lot of those communities look exactly as they did in the 1960s. But in every sense that actually matters, that community had changed dramatically. And I think this is true to a lesser or greater extent of almost every community. If you try to freeze it in amber, I think you actually kill it.
I'm trying to remember what my question was now. That was a very good ending. So one thing that you've talked about, and we didn't get a ton into it in this, but I think when a lot of us think about planning, about master planning, community meetings, city planners, a lot of planners in this room and folks who are connected in some way, people think about zoning.
Do we have a lot of planners in here?
If you do any planning work, raise your hand. Yeah, look at that, hundreds.
True to form, the planners are a little nervous.
I know for a fact that you didn't raise your hands just now.
If you've ever been yelled at in a public meeting, raise your hand. Hey, there you go.
People love me.
But so what if we're not spending time on things like zoning or even with a more liberalized zoning where we're not processing as many permits, reviews? I mean, what then does planning focus on? How do people still guide the growth of their city if that tool is not a tool that they're using or not using as frequently?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm a city planner, trained city planner. I think city planning is hugely important. And actually, as I argue in the book, I think one of the costs of the zoning system is that I think we've actually wasted a lot of our really incredible city planning capacity in this country, having people who are deeply passionate and care just to an incredible degree about their communities so much that they go into city planning, which I will tell you is not financially remunerative. That's why I had to write this book, But like, people go into this because they care deeply about their community, and then we kind of waste them processing variances for parking relief, or we waste them processing the exact same rezoning over and over again. What is that person doing instead? I think city planning is hugely important for building equitable, healthy, sustainable communities, right? I mean, from a purely land use perspective, for sure, we need to think through the problem of incompatible neighbors, dealing with things like negative externalities, spillover effects, noise, light pollution, stormwater runoff. Those are hugely important issues that, I talk in so many jurisdictions where they have like the most sophisticated zoning code you've ever seen in your life, and then they like don't even have like a noise ordinance that's longer than 2 sentences, or they don't have like a plan for stormwater runoff, right? And it's like, I think you kind of missed the plot here, right? Like these are the important things that actually really affect people's quality of life, and we need to get better at that. Second is, to the extent that planning shapes infrastructure, that shapes the form of communities. And I breezed through it here, but again, I'll go to so many jurisdictions and they'll have, a 1,000-page zoning district or zoning code, and they won't even have a streets map. Like they won't even have a long-term plan to like build out streets as growth happens, right? And it's like, that's like OG city planning, right? Like that's like what, Hippodamus of Miletus or whatever, sorry, I haven't taken my AICP exam in a while. That's what the original planner was doing, like just draw out street grid.
Romans were doing street plans and now we're gonna do that.
Right. Plan out your streets to where you're gonna have an interconnected network, plan out your parks, have a long-term plan for growth to where growth actually enriches current residents rather than impoverishes them, which I think is the way that a lot of current suburban sprawl growth, I think that's actually what it does. Have that long-term plan for growth, and to the extent that you have this long-term plan for infrastructure and public amenities, I think you can actually guide and shape growth in a much more meaningful way than just saying, well, we're going to write up this code where we say for every single parcel in the city, this is the permitted use and this is the permitted density.
So before this talk, me, Joel, and Cade gave Nolan a tour of Flint, and I'm just curious, what were some things that stood out to you about the city?
Well, it's sunny and 70 every day, right? No, yeah, I mean, I think a city like Flint, like so many other rusty cities, I love that, rusty cities, the unbelievably strong bones, right? I mean, just, great streets, great architecture, great public amenities that have been inherited from earlier generations. Not everything that happened, particularly in the 70s and 80s, achieved what it's trying to accomplish. But you have a lot of these incredible things that cities, that are a fraction of the size of Flint don't have, right? Something I find very endearing about Flint, as in many rusty cities, is the fierce sense of pride that people have in the city. To my mind, like, we think about cities and we imagine like a skyline and we imagine a lot of buildings, but cities is people, right? Like it's all the people. And if you don't have people that believe in the long-term project of a place, then you might as well already have died as a city. But places that maybe they've gone through a rough 50 or 60 years, but they still have people who are like, this is my home and I'm committed to it and I love it. And I know we have problems, but I'm going to show you all the cool shit in this town. That's more important than any HUD grant or any enlightened city plan. So, it's all the people. That's a proud pleaser, by the way.
I love that. Thank you. So, last question from me. Is there anything that you really wanted to write in your book that you didn't get a chance to put into it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I had to cut the chapter on Flint. My editor was like,
That's why you're here.
What in the world is this? No, that's a really, really good question. So there is an appendix on the broader city planning system, how that works.
Right.
That was a big fight to keep that in. So be sure to read the appendix. You know, I think a little bit of reckoning with other attempts to reform zoning. So, you know, I've worked with a lot of new urbanists who are very passionate about form-based codes, and I think form-based codes, you know, to the extent that they really do remove a lot of these arbitrary use and density rules and focus on what buildings look like, I think that can be a really positive step in the right direction, and I wish I had spent a little bit more time talking about that. You know, I think it's kind of funny because almost as soon as the book went to press, there were already like a half dozen examples of zoning reform that I would have preferred to highlight. So, you know, that's another thing that I wish I could have included more of. You know, there's a lot of examples of cities and states adopting exciting reforms in the book, but, you know, literally like probably 10 times as many examples have happened in the past year since the book's been out. So, and in places, again, that you don't expect, that often don't even get much praise for being leaders on these issues, right? So, yeah, maybe in the second edition. Maybe arbitrary lines too. Two arbitrary, two lines.
We'll be looking forward to buying that.
That'll be good. Well, I think my last question, and then we'll open it up. Well, let's just first, does anyone in the audience have a question they'd like to ask? If so, raise your hand so we can know if it's, okay, oh, we got folks, all right. My last question would be, I think some people have concerns when we talk about more development that if we start seeing more construction in my neighborhood, or people start building more housing, it's going to get more expensive. And that by having zoning that maybe is more restrictive, it makes sure that all this new development doesn't cause higher rents or higher home prices in my neighborhood. What are your thoughts on that? Has there been any effort, you know, to look into this kind of a topic? And is this a concern that is sort of rooted in actual things that have happened where we've seen liberalized zoning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in general, new development is going to be a lagging indicator that prices are going up, right? In general, your existing home prices or your rents will have gone up a certain point, and that'll signal to the market, oh cool, we can actually make some money if we go build something here. So in general, right, you see this, there's a lag between buildings actually getting built and prices going up. So what's happening in that case is the existing stock is getting more expensive. And that's what's going to happen. When a neighborhood becomes more desirable, the home prices are going to go up. And actually, I think it's the opposite of what I think a lot of people think, where if you build a lot of these additional units in that neighborhood, you absorb a lot of that demand, and that relieves pressure on the existing supply. So there's this great, right, you know, there's an economist who calls the new apartment buildings yuppie fish tanks or whatever, right? Like the idea is like you build a new apartment building and it absorbs all the demand for housing in that neighborhood, and that avoids them going out and bidding up the price of existing homes that might exist or bidding up the price of rent. And displacing current residents. So, you know, and then I would also say too, in neighborhoods where there is rising price pressure, in many cases that's downstream of a high opportunity neighborhood that maybe isn't building a lot of housing. So I think that's what's happening in a lot of gentrifying neighborhoods in the US is that in many cases there's a high opportunity neighborhood that's successfully blocked any housing from being built. And so people who maybe want to live near that neighborhood or want to live in an urban neighborhood have to go over to more marginalized communities and bid up the price of housing. And we could probably ease a lot of that pressure if we did a better job of building in high opportunity neighborhoods and suburbs.
Awesome. Well, all right, so I will hand you this wired mic and take the wireless mic out to the audience.